Next, we have Dr. Kim Withers. She is a research scientist at Center for Coastal Studies, Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi. Got her PhD from Texas A&M University in College Station in Wildlife and Fisheries, and her talk is going to be on the effects of beach raking on invertebrate Infauna. Now, this is a study done on the National Seashore. Kim?
Thanks, John. Okay. I don't have lots of pretty pictures for y'all, but I do want to talk a little bit about a study that we did out on the seashore. Let's see, I believe in 1997. It was a few years ago, but the results are still relevant. I have my grad student here, Tanika Engelhardt. She's in San Diego now, but I wanted to acknowledge her because she did the majority of the work here. Oops, I just did something that I don't know what. Okay. Tony and some of the others have probably already touched on why sargassum is important and all the seaweed that comes in on the beach. As it decomposes, in some cases anyway, it adds nutrients to the adjacent systems. Most of these systems, like the nearshore beach area, don't have a lot of nutrient sources, and so the sargassum is an important source of nutrients. The beach also doesn't get very much organic material, and organic material is important to the organisms that live on the beach, and so the sargassum provides a major source of organic material. This, as it breaks down, is a major food source for beach invertebrates, and the sargassum itself also provides a habitat for shorebirds. Tony showed you some use of the weed line by sanderlings and laughing gulls. If you notice and pay attention, a lot of times you'll see a lot of birds hopping around in that rack line where the sargassum accumulates, eating a variety of organisms, not some of the flies, as Tony mentioned, but there's also some little crustaceans that live in there called sandhoppers that the birds feed on as well. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to look at in this study was to see whether the removal of sargassum from the beach actually affected how many beach invertebrates there were and also how much they weighed. Why is their weight important? Well, they're really small, and sometimes where their abundance is not affected, their actual biomass can be affected, and vice versa. We looked at several groups, two amphipod, which are small crustaceans. They're sort of shrimp-like in the genus Hostorius and Orchestia. Hostorius live further down the beach near the surf line. Orchestia actually are those sandhoppers that live up in the rack line. They're essentially a terrestrial amphipod. Polychaetes, which are marine worms, very similar to earthworms on land, but much smaller, and then a variety of insects. Okay, so why are the invertebrates important? Well, they process the organic material. They convert that organic material into what's called, in scientific parlance, usable animal biomass. In other words, they eat the dead sargassum, and then something eats them. They help to irrigate the sediments through their burrowing activity, so they bring in water, they bring in oxygen, and they bring in nutrients. And they're eaten by birds and fish. So they're sort of the base of the food chain. And if you just look at this sort of diagrammatic food chain, when the beach is exposed, there's some microalgae that lives in the sediments, but it's not a very big source. There's lots of invertebrates, and then there's shorebirds that eat these. When the beach is inundated, there's fish, wading birds, and large fish, but these invertebrates are important to both organisms that use the beach when it's exposed, as well as organisms that use the beach when it's flooded, and sargassum and other detritus that comes in is a major food source to these invertebrates. The kind of weight of the arrow indicates how important it is, and so sargassum and detritus are major sources of food for these invertebrates. Okay, so our study area was Padre Island National Seashore. Padre Island is the longest barrier island in the world, and Padre Island National Seashore basically protects the longest undeveloped stretch of barrier island in the world. It was established in about 1970, and they use raking rather than front-end loaders to remove sargassum only in a few areas. So they use mechanical raking, and here's their kind of setup. It's a smallish tractor that has this rake thing, and I've got another picture here in a moment that you can see, but you can see kind of what it does too. It rakes rather than removing most of the sediment, and so a lot of the sand actually remains behind, and the main thing that goes is the sargassum. They use it just in a few areas, mainly the Malachite Beach Visitor Center and the campground area, and this is to improve the aesthetics of the beach for their visitors. It probably does disturb the biota, and I'll show that in a minute. They do regulate the type of equipment to this, and they use only the rakes and the depth to which the rakes can go. So it's a relatively shallow type of equipment versus sort of the deeper sediment that's taken out with the front end loaders. They don't allow any raking in areas where sea turtles nest, and presumably, and if there were to be in the visitor center or the campground a sea turtle nesting there, they would suspend raking. And again, this was 10 years ago, so things may be different here. Here's a close-up of the mechanics of the thing. It is just sort of like a big yard rake. We had them set up 2 raking treatments for us. One in which the beach was raked weekly, and one in which it was raked only every other week. And we had areas that were unraked to serve as controls so that we can compare the raked areas to the unraked areas. In the weekly treatment, we sampled the invertebrates 3 and 7 days after raking, and in the bi-weekly treatment, 3, 7, 10, and 14 days after raking, and the area was raked from the dune line to the water line. This just kind of shows how we set it up. We had a line along the back, so we would always go back to the same place. And then right at the high tide line, then just below the high tide line, we set up some imaginary rectangles that were the quadrats where we took samples from. And then we used this very sophisticated sampling device, a piece of PVC that was 4 inches or 10 by 10 centimeters or 10 centimeters in diameter. We stuck it about 4 inches into the ground. We took 4 cores in each one of those sampling areas, and we sampled 2 of the rectangular quadrats in each treatment. We fixed and preserved the samples, then we sorted them in the lab, we ID'd and counted the organisms, then we dried and weighed them, and then we extrapolated the numbers out to number per meter square or gram dry weight per meter square. That's a normal thing that's done so that you can estimate the total numbers. And then in order to test to see whether there were differences between the treatments, we used an analysis of variance. Okay, this just summarizes all the results. If it says ND, it means there's no difference. If it says C greater than T, which is everybody else, it means the control had more than the treatment. And so just in a nutshell here, you can see that the hostoriids, these are the amphipods that live down close to the surf line, there was no difference in their numbers between the control and the treatments, no matter how many days there was. For the rest of these, the orchestia, the sandhoppers that live in the rack line, the polychaetes, the worms, basically the controls had more than the treatments up until day 10, and then at day 14, then there was finally no difference between the treatments and the controls. And the insects, there was a difference after 3 days, but by the time 7 days rolled around, then there was no difference between the treatments and controls. So there were differences in the numbers of these organisms, especially for the orchestia, the sandhoppers, and the polychaetes, the worms. Okay, so the hostaurid amphids were essentially unaffected, but they're a low-shore species, and I'll talk about the implications of that in a minute. The orchestia amphipods, the sandhoppers, were affected. They're the rackline species, but they weren't different from the control after day 10. The polychaetes were not different after day 10, and the insects were only slightly affected. They were not different from the control after day 3. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, some of the inverts were able to recolonize quickly. The hostorids, which are down on the low shore, and probably weren't as affected in the first place by the raking because they were probably closer to the water, their numbers could recolonize from areas that hadn't been raked fairly quickly. The insects as well, they were affected right away, but they have pretty fast turnover times, meaning that they can recolonize fairly quickly. The others, though, take more time, the Orchestia and the polychaetes, and these are the two species that are probably primary shorebird food. All of these, though, had recovered by day 14, and so in the short term, raking probably decreases food supplies for birds, but what's kind of the mix here is that the migration is typically greatest before and after the sargassum influx. So most of the time, the birds, late in the migration season, when the sargassum first comes in, the birds would be affected. Early in the fall migration season, when sargassum is still present on the beach, the birds would be affected. But in that sort of middle period, June and July, when visitation is probably the highest, then the birds would probably not be affected by the fact that the food supplies are probably decreased in these areas. However, there are other organisms that depend on these organisms as well. Okay, so some of the management recommendations we made to the seashore was to rake from May to August only, and it didn't really matter whether it was weekly or bi-weekly. However, if you're trying to look at overall ecosystem health from the standpoint of inputs of organic material, nutrients, and then the action of the invertebrates to recycle nutrients, to irrigate sediments, etc., the less raking, the better. And the study was funded by Padre Island National Seashore. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
You said that the populations recover in 14 days, but if they're doing it bi-weekly, over time...
That's what I mean. Yeah, they have recovered by the 14th day, but then they get raked away again. So, there's not... It would be different if they would recover quickly. If everybody would recover at the rate that the insects did by day 3, then, bi-weekly raking probably wouldn't make a huge difference, but they're only just barely recovering. So you've got maybe 3 or 4 days of, populations back to about what they're supposed to be before they get raked away again. And clearly in the weekly raking, nobody ever has, except for the insects, has a chance to recover. Yeah, Marianne.
You made management recommendations based on bird migration.
Mm-hmm.
We do have birds that stay here around, but that's not migratory, and it would also depend on the system, right?
Well, it would. The numbers tend to be fairly low. If you look at some bird counts that have been done on Padre Island over the years, especially some work that Alan Cheney did, numbers in the summer tend to be pretty minimal. And because, as far as shorebirds go, now there's plenty of gulls and stuff like that, and I didn't address impacts to gulls. I really was just looking at what shorebirds were doing because they're the primary users of things like amphipods, polychaetes, and hostorids. The gulls eat other things that are associated with the sargassum, but the polychaetes and stuff are what the shorebirds are looking for. And yes, there are a few shorebirds that hang out during the summer. But when you look at the magnitude of difference between the migration periods and who hangs out during the summer, it's pretty small numbers. That's why a lot of my students that do shorebird work, we don't even continue through the summer because the numbers are so low that it's really almost hard on a lot of sites to even find anybody.
Okay,
So.
It's not birds and other shorebirds from the seagull.
So. Okay, yeah, shorebirds, yeah. Jim?
What is it about the raking process that causes the population to decrease? Mechanical removal of these?
I think it's probably both mechanical removal and also just disruption of the habitat. Now, we did do some additional analysis with this that looked at sediment chlorophyll, sediment organic carbon, and sediment and water content, and all of those things were not affected by the raking. So my feeling is that it's really mostly mechanical removal versus, some alteration of the sediment parameters that would prevent them from living. Does that answer your question? Okay. Anybody else?
Did you or has anybody looked at donax and ghost crabs? Because I used to see loads of both, and I rarely see either anymore.
In this study, we did not come across any of those organisms, and so we, specifically, no one has looked at either of those. I think one of the things that may save them, at least in Padre Island's scenario of just raking, is that they're further down at the very, very edge of the water. And when I say they raked to the edge of the water, well, they raked as close to the edge as they could get. They really weren't raking down in the swash zone, and that's where most of the donax and the mole crabs live. When they're front-end loading, they're taking huge amounts, but the raking, they couldn't get down that close, I don't think, and so they never showed up in any of our samples, either of those. And they should have or could have if they were present. They may have just not been present either. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim.